I am Lenny Marcus, co-director of the National Preparedness Leadership Initiative, a joint program of the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and the Kennedy School of Government Center for Public Leadership. We're here today with Rich Serino. Rich is colleague, friend, teacher, and student. Rich is former chief of the Boston Emergency Medical Services. He was with Boston EMS for 36 years. In 2009, he joined FEMA with the Obama administration for 5 years. And Rich, we're thrilled to have you here at Harvard now as a distinguished senior fellow. So we're here to talk about the transformation of FEMA. FEMA had gone through a really tough set of years before you arrived. Hurricane Katrina was a crucible leadership event for the United States in terms of the leadership of that agency and all the other leaders that were involved. How did you transform, or how were you a part of that transformation? What did you do, and how did you do it?
Well, I think one thing you said is I was part of the transformation. It was an entire team effort, but looking at how we reframed and changed the culture within FEMA, and there were 5 different ways that we did that. One of the first ways we did that was to actually look at the language that we were using, and one of the things that we did is looked at what we call whole of community. Initially, we didn't call it that, but how do we bring people together that haven't been brought together in the past? How do we bring it together, the federal, the state, the local, and the tribal governments? Each one of those brings a lot to the table, and especially the local capabilities. So as we bring together those levels of government, but then we also realized we had to reach out past that. We had to reach out to the faith-based community, that in every community throughout this country, we actually didn't work with the faith-based community, looking at what they're able to do in their community. We also then reached out to the nonprofit agencies, such as the Red Cross, the Salvation Army. I was rather surprised that we didn't have an agreement with the American Red Cross, a signed agreement. So we engaged and just had a side agreement with the American Red Cross. Then we also reached out, and as we have the federal, state, local, tribal governments, the nonprofits, the faith-based community, but also reaching out to the private sector. We didn't have a relationship with the private sector that was very good at all. So we developed an office within FEMA, and we actually brought people in initially from Target that actually became part of the National Response Coordination Center. 3 months at a time, somebody from Target was there. The next 3 months, we had somebody from Citicorp and all different industry that actually became embedded in part of FEMA. So we had this established that eventually became called whole community. But the most important part of that community was the people, and looking at what we would call survivors. For years, we called people victims, but it's really changing the language to look at people as survivors. Because when you call somebody a survivor versus a victim, it has a completely different meaning. So very intentional, call people survivors. So as we start to frame all that, to look at people differently, to bring together the whole of community, specifically call it the whole of community, and look at people as survivors versus victims, is how we looked at both, mainly the external part of FEMA.
Well, you also had the morale issues within the agency as well. What did you do there?
A number of things. People were walking around literally with their heads down at FEMA. And I remember going through my Senate confirmation hearing, and one of the things that I wanted to do was to help change the culture. One of the first things I did was to go around. At the time, we're in 13 different buildings in Washington, D.C., now in 1. But 13 different buildings in Washington, D.C., went around, talked to all the folks. We have 10 regions throughout the countries, visited each one of the regions, ended up multiple times, and listened to what people had to say. Asked people 2 questions. If you wanted to, why did you come to work for FEMA? And the second question, if you could fix, change, or improve one thing, what would it be? And from those ideas actually helped formulate, we were going to go, able to talk to almost 5,000 employees in the first few months by going out, listening to them both in D.C. and throughout the regions and some of our other specialty offices.
I remember visiting you shortly after you took on the job. You were sworn in, and you said, oh, and by the way, I'm also Chief Operating Officer of the agency. Did that give you a sense of the mechanics and what needed to be changed?
It really did, and that helped quite a bit, is to actually, was something nobody told me before going through the Senate confirmation process, that maybe somebody could have mentioned that small fact, but it turned out to be a great thing. Because as the COO, a Chief Operating Officer, you're actually responsible for the budget. You're responsible for, about a $20 billion budget at the time, and looking at how that money is spent, where it's spent, how to look at that. And there really weren't a lot of metrics. So established something called FEMA Stat. where we were able to go and look, using a lot of metrics, look very deeply into different areas, institute a very rigorous budget process that hadn't been there in the past, and look at how we're actually spending our money, what the money is being spent on that's correct, and where we shouldn't be spending money, how we can readdress that money and use that money in a better way to serve the survivors.
I remember one time visiting you, and you said, "I've got to tell you about FEMA Corps." I think innovation is an important element of transformation as well.
I think taking the ability to innovate as things happens, and one of those came with an idea I had. Actually, initially came to me when I was in Joplin after the worst tornadoes this country's seen. Managed thousands of volunteers that were managed by volunteers in AmeriCorps volunteers, and then I was in Ballstrip, Texas, following fires with another division of AmeriCorps that were helping replant the trees. And it was fascinating to me that we have young people that could do in a year of service to the country. Well, why couldn't we establish something called FEMA Corps? And I had an opportunity where they brought undersecretaries, that was my official title, into the White House one evenings to come up with new ideas. And so I went to the meeting in the Roosevelt Room with the president's chief of staff and the head of Office of Management and Budget, and going around the table, about 14 of us, and any new ideas. And after a while, I said, well, I have this crazy idea of FEMA Corps, 18 to 24-year-olds, do a year of service to the country, teach them about teamwork, but also about how to respond during disasters. And talked for just a few minutes, and it actually could save us a lot of money in the tens of millions of dollar range. So they were interested, and then about 20 minutes into it, the president came into the room, and the president walked around the table, came to everybody, he got to me, he says, "Oh, I only see you when bad things happen." I was like, "Really?" I didn't say that, but but it's, and so sat down, and the head of OMB leaned over to me and said, tell him about this. So I told the president my idea for FEMA Corps, and he says, "I really like that idea." So at the end of, the meeting, another 45 minutes, he says, "Well, let's walk across the whole hall to the Oval Office to get a picture taken. And Richie, tell me more about this FEMA Corps." Mm-hmm. So we're walking across, and I hadn't really told a soul about FEMA Corps. It was just an idea. Mm-hmm. So I'm telling him, and as I said, I wasn't making it all up as I come along, but a little bit. But I had the basics. And he really liked the idea of FEMA Corps. So we established FEMA Corps. That was November 22nd.
In 2011.
2011. And by February 2012, we had a signed agreement with the AmeriCorps and CCC.
That's pretty quick.
That's pretty quick for government.
Right.
And then we were able to bring together all the different partners in that period of time who could help us with the process, who could, more importantly, stop the process, and educated lots of people there. Then we had to actually build the program and get 18 to 24-year-olds who were interested and develop the training, which we did over the summer. And then in September, they were graduating by the end of September into October. And their first deployment was Hurricane Isaac for a small group of them, but then Hurricane Sandy came, and all at the time, 480 of them, two classes of 240, were deployed to Sandy, which made a huge difference in how we responded to Sandy. And also what they did during Sandy, them coming up with new ideas, and again, listening to folks, transformed how FEMA does business today. And then we were fortunate enough that we had the president who came up to visit New York, and him to able to meet the first FEMA Corps team in New York City following the Hurricane Sandy, less than a year from a crazy idea.
So how did that innovation breed other innovations?
Well, one of the things that we did is at the time we weren't using iPads at all. We just ordered some iPads, and we used to walk around with our what we called community relations team and give people a piece of paper to call if you need help. Call 1-800-621-FEMA or go online to register. But unfortunately, to go online to register was literally taking hours and sometimes weeks to get through. And they said, "Can you give us an iPad?" So if you give an 18 to 24-year-old an iPad, it can really make a huge difference. So we were able to get some iPads pretty quickly. I remember we ordered them, and I remember they came in, and knowing how efficient federal government is, I knew they were still in the basement of FEMA, and they were.
Right.
So we were able to send a number of them up to the FEMA Corps members, and they started registering people at their shelter or in their homes in a third of the time it would take to register them any other way. and to give people services where they were. So helping the survivors, and helped us actually to start to frame, as we started to look at our strategic plan for the next 5 years after that, was the number one priority was to be survivor-centric. And that came out of what they were doing. And now everybody has iPads, using GPS, using a lot of technology in how we register to help survivors in the field, how we can do look at various components of a disaster and get them the help they need, whether it's into a hotel quicker, get money quicker. And that's one of about 30 different things that FEMA Corps and an innovation team did during Sandy.
So let me see if I got the points correct. The first one that you talked about is reorienting the agency. So the whole of community really reoriented to what you're doing and who you're working with. And then the survivor, for people who survived rather than victim, really oriented you differently towards the people. The second thing that you talked about was the reach out to the business community, the reach out to the Red Cross, so that you were a lot bigger because you were part of that larger system that you created. The third thing was engaging with your employees, going out and asking them why they're working there and what they would change. And of course, then, as I remember, you actually changed some of those things.
We changed a number of things. In fact, at one time during a disaster, I was out in Region 7 in Kansas City, and one of the employees, because when I went and talked to people, I spent 15 minutes just saying, these are our mission, our goals, and what we wanted to do, and asking the two questions. But then I walked around to everybody's individual office or cubicle, if they worked in a warehouse, wherever they worked, and then followed up with the two questions to get their answers just one-on-one. And that's where people would tell you really interesting things, and really things that, again, helped us change the way we do business.
Well, the fourth thing was, in your role as Chief Operating Officer, you really changed the mechanics. You changed the budgeting, you changed the data, so you knew what you were doing a lot better. And 5, innovation, because once you brought in one innovation, it created all sorts of other innovations, the FEMA Corps, and of course what they did with the iPad. So we talk at the NPLI a lot about meta leadership, person, situation, connectivity. How did that play out in your mind going through that process?
Well, having been in the first NPLI course back many years ago, it actually gave a framework as you start to look at, as we call the whole community at FEMA. It really is basic on understanding the person, how you're able to lead up to your boss, whoever that is, how are you able to lead the people that you work for. And to have them have some faith in you and to understand them, but also to lead across. FEMA actually has very little authority during a disaster. They're never in charge, if you will. It's usually the governor is in charge, and FEMA's there to support the governor. But we're able to do that, to bring the resources in, but you have to work across and beyond, because I don't have any authority as a deputy administrator of FEMA. In my old position as chief of EMS and boss, I had zero. But how do you work with people? How do I work with the, a mayor in North Dakota? How do I work with the city manager in Joplin? And those are all things that you had to be able to do.
Well, Rich, thank you for your service to Boston, your service to the country, and it's just a pleasure to have you now with us at the NPLI.
Great. I love being here. Thank you.
Thank you.